Welcome to another episode of the PS We Expire podcast. I'm Morgan Motzinger, and today you get to listen to my conversation with Dr. Nick Morgan. Nick is one of America's top communication speakers, theorists, and coaches. He is a passionate teacher, and he's committed to helping people find clarity in their thinking and ideas, and then being able to deliver them with panache. He's been commissioned by Fortune 50 companies to write for many CEOs and presidents, and he has coached people to give congressional testimony, appear in the media, and deliver unforgettable TED Talks. He has spoken himself. He's led conferences and moderated panels at venues around the world. And during the last election cycle, he even provided expert commentary on the presidential debates for CNN. His latest book, Can You Hear Me?, was published by Harvard in 2018, and it's all about the perils of virtual communication. So I read his book, Can You Hear Me?, and had just a really great conversation with him about how we not only how we navigate in this virtual world, but also what are some of the problems with not being able to communicate face-to-face very much, and how we sometimes get boxed in by the convenience of online communication, whether that's emails or texting. We talk a little bit about emojis and what ends up happening, what we lose by virtual communication. And I think that in not only just in our largely digital world, but also how much time we spend on social media, we really talk about the impacts of when we really only have relationships that are online, even if they're just one-sided relationships. So what that actually does from a neuroscience perspective, what that does when it comes to these rates of depression and loneliness that have just skyrocketed in the last handful of years, and how as businesses do we navigate the virtual landscape with employees, with clients. And we talk about really like what deep, meaningful connection and communication can look like. So I really, really enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Nick Morgan, and I think that you will as well. I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you so much for joining me on the PS We Expire podcast. I just finished your book that you published in 2018, Can You Hear Me? All about the pitfalls and how to really connect with people on a deep level in this age of virtual communication. And I would love to just start out by reading a quote from your book that says, virtual relationships are more fragile and easily disrupted because they lack the unconscious connections our face-to-face interactions automatically convey. The lift of an eyebrow, the tone of a voice, a quick smile, a shake of the head, these are the ways we decode other people's intents. These signals are largely absent from all forms of digital communication. And I think that quote is a great way to kind of dive into what is happening with this virtual communication world, and how we can be not only better communicators, but also still maintain connections, true connections with other people in this largely digital world that we live in.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks for having me on your show, Morgan. It's a great pleasure to connect with you again. Since Morgan, if you don't know, was on my podcast a while back. So I'm very excited. That'll be coming out soon, or maybe after, depending on the timing. Anyway, yes, to the point. So my favorite stat about all this is when I was doing the research for the book in 2017, 2018, 5% of the Fortune 1000 companies were using video conferencing in anything like a sustained and more than occasional, more than just a tiny percentage of the people weigh. 5%. And then in March 2020, of course, it was suddenly 100%. I had talked to a CIO to do the research back in 2017 and asked him how long it would take, because I'm a technophile. I love gadgets and tech toys and things. And I was a big fan of, before I did the research, of video conferencing. I thought, what a great tool. You don't have to go anywhere. You can do this from the comfort of your living room or your office or whatever. And he said it would take my company, Fortune 1000 company, 3 years to implement widespread video conferencing. And I sort of nodded and just took him at his word. And then by a weird coincidence, I was chatting with him the third week of March 2020. And so I said, how long did it take? And he said, took 3 days. Well, 90% of folks were up and running, and then the rest of them we got it the other 2 days. It was a week total. And we were laughing about that. Needs must when the devil drives. So the bottom line here is that video conferencing was a lifesaver then. It's an incredible convenience, and it's also compromised in a lot of ways that are not so obvious. So one of the tricks of this is that you and I are looking at each other now on a video conference as we have this conversation, and we're used to looking at images on television and the movies and photographs, and our brains automatically translate that into real flesh and blood human beings. But what we're actually seeing is a two-dimensional image of each other who are real human beings when we're in person. And in those two dimensions, the first thing that happens is our faces get flattened, and a lot of the expressive nooks and crannies of the face, let's say a lot of the muscles get just flattened out. And so less emotion gets through. Now, you can turn the volume up, you can wave your hands around and shout, and scream. But what's really missing then is the nuances of what we're talking about. And when you cut out the nuances, it's not so much as the like the train wreck aspect of this. It's not the if I say something shocking, you'll pay attention, but it's more the nuances. One of the things we look to, for example, from the person that we're talking to is to let us know what's important to them and what isn't. So our attention waxes and wanes a little bit. And if somebody says, hey, Morgan, you really should pay attention to this, then we'll focus in a little bit more. Those kind of things get cut out of the video conferencing. And of course, more so if anybody's still using audio conferencing, and even more out of text-based communication. And that's the other point worth making. We communicate via text more than any other form of communication, whether it's email or Slack, if your company uses that, or of course, texting of various kinds. And so we send an enormous amount of information through that way, and the possibilities of misconstruing what's said on text-based communications are enormous. My favorite example of this is I always ask people when I'm talking about it, has anybody in the room ever sent the following email or text message? Good job, great job, nice job. With or without exclamation points, I don't care. You can have as many as you want. And of course, everybody sent that email or that text because they're nice people, and they've sent them to their colleagues saying, good job, great job, nice job, with lots of exclamation points. And then I say, okay, would it surprise you to learn that 60% of the time, if that person who received the message reports to you, they will assume that it's sarcastic. And people are shocked when they hear that. How could they get that? And it's because obviously you can say, good job, nice job, great job, in a warm, sincere, friendly way, or you can say it in a sarcastic way, or you can say it in a mean way, or you can say it in a cold way. And what matters to people is that intent, what's behind the words. And it doesn't come through very well in text-based communications.
When I heard this idea of that communication is really about what is heard, that really changed the way that I started to talk to people, because, it's impossible really to get into somebody else's lived experience and to perceive the things that are coming in through their ears, through their experience, through, their own feelings about themselves or their work performance. But it's very difficult to really understand that what I'm saying is not necessarily what the other person is hearing. And so that's where this understanding of our need to be so clear in our communication, and to also not rely heavily on things like emojis. When you were talking about these text messages that we're sending, it's a really, I don't think I really thought about emojis in this way before, but it's like emojis are trying to fill in the gaps in our communication that's lost through the verbal and the visual back and forth. And so we've kind of like been relying on these little digital characters to communicate emotion in a different way. But even those can be wildly misinterpreted. And that really is 60%. That is a staggering statistic. That says a
Yeah,
lot about how people feel about themselves.
exactly. And there are two things to understand about that. First of all, when we get less information about intent, and what we humans care about is each other's intent more than anything else. So we're constantly scanning the communications we're getting from other people for their intent. What does Morgan really mean by this? What does Jane, what does Bill, what does Harry mean by this communication or that communication? And so we care about intent. And in the virtual world, when less of the intent gets through, then we have a negativity bias. And that was the first thing I found out really in my research. And I was kind of shocked by that. What is this thing called negativity bias, and why would we have it? And then when you think about it in evolutionary terms, it makes a lot of sense. If you're the lead person in a troop of your tribe, walking through the savannah, and you see a shadow, it's a brilliant survival move to assume that it's a saber-toothed tiger. It's a really bad survival move to assume that it's just a flicker of sunlight. And so you can make the argument that we're descended from the anxious members of our species. And so we're all a little twitchy. More seriously, we're all trying to keep ourselves alive. And in evolutionary sense, the human wiring doesn't change that fast. So we're still operating this way. We're wired to be incredibly alert for short-term danger and literal threats to our person. And so the negativity bias is simply that urge of our brain to be scanning the horizon for danger, and trying to keep us alive by taking evasive action in the instant before the saber-toothed tiger leaps. And so that's the negativity bias. It's just when you don't get enough information about what's going on, it kind of makes sense to assume the worst. But what that means is, in the long run, all virtual communications degrade over time, because if any of your viewers or listeners have an old house, you'll know immediately what I mean. If you've got old plumbing, what happens to the plumbing over time is it gradually fills up with stuff called scale, and you get eventually the pipe, which used to look like that, becomes pinhole size, and the water only trickles through, and the plumber comes in and goes, time to pull it all out and put in nice modern plastic piping. But that's what's happening in the virtual world. The communications are gradually getting cluttered up with little negative assumptions and reactions, because of the lack of perfect information. And there's a bunch of technical reasons also for this. I'll give you just one quick one, and then you can tell me how much is too much, but because I could geek out about this forever. But when we're speaking on video conference, the sound and the sight, the video, don't come through at the same speed. Now, we're all familiar with this when there's a movie with the soundtrack out of sync and how awkward that is.
It's so annoying.
It's almost unwatchable, isn't it? Yeah. All right. Well, this bit of out of sync is only 3 milliseconds long, and that's not long enough to register to your conscious mind. But it is enough to register to your unconscious mind, which is much faster and more on the job than your conscious mind can possibly be. And it picks up that slight lag, and it says, "Oh, Nick is a little stupider than I thought."
Well, that combined with that combined with the negativity bias is like a recipe for disaster, really.
Exactly. And there are half a dozen other things that we could talk about in terms of the technical problems that are not visible and obvious to us. What we're seeing is HD picture quality, and so it looks amazing. So it's not obvious, but they all add up to creating a situation which is less than optimal for our information-starved human unconscious mind.
So a couple of things came to mind for me. One of them is the the heavy use of filters in social media, I don't think that I considered the cost of that also ends up creating another barrier between someone being able to really interpret what you're saying. Because if that becomes a layer that masks the nuance in our facial expressions, in our facial movements, that also can create this another sense of disconnection from the person that we're talking with. But when I loved your illustration of the plumber coming in and the pipes being, having smaller and smaller flow through, immediately what I thought of was cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. I'm thinking about the plumber giving you an estimate for what it's going to take to fix this.
Right.
And that made me think, what is the cost for us in our connections with other people, in the ways that we feel not alone in this world? What is the cost when our communication with others is becoming more and more of a trickle as we have all this buildup of problems that come with our virtual communication? So can you talk a little bit about, I know before we started recording, you were sharing with me that some of the data that's coming out of the work that neuroscientists are doing is that we're not really understanding the cost of having so much of our communication virtual now.
There's so many ways in which relying too much on virtual communications is problematic, and especially because we've become more comfortable with it. So we don't see the perils. We're used to it, and in some ways that's even worse. One of the issues is when you think about a workplace and creating a team in the workplace, there are certain people who have been there the longest, and maybe they're in charge, and maybe they're higher up in the hierarchy, maybe not, but they're well established in that workplace community. You bring in new people, how do they get brought in, and how do they get enculturated to that community? And when you add the virtual complication to that, then the answer is they don't get processed in as well as folks who've been there for a long time. And the negativity bias can mean that over time they get hurt the worst. And if they're junior people, if they've been recently hired, if they're part of an effort to make the workplace more diverse, you can imagine all kinds of scenarios where it's not the folks who were already in power, typically the middle-aged white males, who are hurt most in that scenario. It's the new people, it's the junior people, it's the younger people, and I particularly worry about that in terms of workplace fairness. So that's just one area. The other is the effect on you personally. So one of my favorite ways to understand this is to say, what happens when we get together with people? And I often have folks talk about this scenario. We haven't been in person for a long time. Let's say we get back together, we get the team together. This is a workplace team. And most people say, especially the introverts, will say, well, we stand around and make awkward chit chat. That's what we do. We talk about sports, if we're really unimaginative, let's say, or dogs or the weather, if we're British, or we come up with stuff. And maybe it takes a while to get into it, and maybe it does get better, but there is this awkwardness. And their attitude is, so why do that? Why put yourself through that? And I'll say, great, glad you noticed that moment and how awkward it was. That's not actually what's happening in those moments. What's happening in those moments is, while you make tiresome chit chat and try to think of what to say to your colleague whom you haven't seen in 6 months in person, then your unconscious mind is busy exchanging huge amounts of data with that other person's unconscious mind. And we're reestablishing connection, and we're saying, yeah, I can trust this person. I remember this person. I know what they're like. And it literally means I know what they look like, sound like, taste like, maybe not, but feel like, and so on. So it's the five senses where the information comes through. When you're not getting that information from the five senses, then that's when the negativity bias comes in, because your brain hates to have a vacuum, hates to have no information coming in through the five senses. remember back to our nervous ancestors who are watching out for saber-toothed tigers. And so what they do is they make it up, and it's safest to make it up with negative information. But anyway, here we are in person. So what we're doing is exchanging huge amounts of data about each other face to face, while our conscious minds are doing the tedious chit chat. So it's a really good thing to do that. And it doesn't happen on Zoom. It doesn't happen on video conferencing in the same way. We're still getting some visual information, but it's problematic in a couple of ways that I already suggested, and a few more that we may or may not get the time to talk about. It's in the book. And it's problematic in terms of where we're occupying space. We're actually not face to face, and our unconscious minds know the difference. And so it's more stressful than it would be if we were face to face.
I think that is so fascinating. Because we've heard these statistics of 70% of communication is nonverbal, but the way that you talk about that it's actually like this sub conversation that's happening is really what that 70% is. It's our unconscious minds getting in touch with each other again. And the cost of not doing that, I mean, this is the statistic out of your book, but it talks about the recent study found that regular face-to-face communication cuts the risk of depression in adults by half, and that phone and email don't have the same effect. And this is really what piqued my interest, was that you said that we may be raising a generation of people who are unhappy communicating virtually and incompetent communicating face-to-face. And I have thought about my children are pretty small still. They're 7 and 12. And I have thought about what are the implications for them growing up in a world that is in this kind of weird space where they're not happy only communicating virtually, but then we've lost the skill set of having those awkward, surfacey conversations in service of not only getting to deeper conscious communication, but all the unconscious communication that's happening. And I thought that the understanding that we're really in an epidemic of depression and loneliness now, and our necessity to rely on virtual communication for a couple of years through the pandemic has really exacerbated this feeling. But I think it already existed as people became more spread out. There's not a lot of people that live near multiple generations of their families or with multiple generations of their families anymore. We're spread out all over the place. And so not only do we have to work harder to establish deep, trusting connections with other people, but then when we are blasting so much of our communication online, it's really this really big negative snowball effect of people feeling more and more alone all the time.
Yeah, you're right absolutely right in that it's a trend or a set of trends that's been going on for quite a while. And used to be 20 years ago, you could ask people about their work life, their home life, and then their hobbies or their church life even. And regardless of whether you're religious or not, it's that third place was a place for creating ties that were neither workplace ties nor necessarily family ties. And participation in organized religion has gone down. As I say, it doesn't matter whether you're religious or not. Just think of it as an activity, a human activity that brought people together. In the same way that sociologist wrote the book Bowling Alone 20 years ago. So the trends have been there for a long time. And the pandemic just sort of speeded everything up. We have actually a lot of data on the effect of it for kids just slightly older than yours. And it's really scary. Essentially, we took 2 years out of their face-to-face education. And as imperfect as that can be, as we all know, if we've had a bad teacher or a bully in our classroom or something, it's much, much worse if you try to learn online. All the education scores went plummeting downward, especially for the sort of middle schoolers who have so much work to do in terms of getting enculturated in how to be a human being and how to grow up and how to find your identity and discover who you are in relation to your peers and all that sort of thing. As I say, sometimes school can feel a little challenging for for the kids and the adults alike. But not having it, we know now objectively, was much worse. And as you alluded to, all the loneliness and depression kind of stats are going in the wrong direction too. So as awkward as it is, yes, we humans need to be face to face. And if we find ourselves in a virtual environment for any length of time or any consistent part of our work life or personal life, then we need to make sure that we're doing things to buttress up that kind of communication.
So what would you recommend are some of the things that, like, on a really practical note, that in personal and work environments to, because obviously, like, the virtual communication scene isn't going anywhere. It's only just
Right.
gonna become more high tech with VR, and a lot more of our work is going to go online. And I'm curious what your take is on how to integrate the in-person and the virtual to be able to still have the creative juices flowing and the
Mm.
connection that we need to do business really well, and to continue to make the impact in the world that we want to.
Yeah, I think we need to develop a new skill, which is survival online, um, and that is to be something which we're all have been talking about for a long time now as being a good thing, which is being authentic and vulnerable with each other.
Mm.
I think we just need to do that exponentially more online. And the reason for that is that, as we said, when you're having that chit chat, your unconscious mind is exchanging information, so it's worth that. Online, the unconscious mind is starved in ways which I described a little bit, and as I say, you just have to take my word for it. There are other ways as well, and so that's not happening. And so chit chat is really a waste of time on Zoom,
Hmm.
because the unconscious mind doesn't get busy in the meantime and start exchanging information. So we can't connect with each other in the way that we're used to doing, and that's the point. And so when you get on Zoom with your work colleagues, you need to talk about stuff that matters, that really matters to you and to them. Otherwise, you're going to start feeling more and more isolated. And I think one of the real traps is, there was a study done on who likes emojis and who doesn't.
Hmm.
And it turned out age 45 was the cutoff. You're over age 45, you think emojis are stupid and childish, you shouldn't do them. If you're under 45, you're doing them already. You're using them already. So that suggests a sort of digital divide, a generational divide, whether it's precisely at age 45 or who knows, doesn't matter. But the point is, if you're younger, and your kids, for example, have grown up without any time at all when they didn't have digital devices around them.
Hmm.
My kids all grew up in the digital era. I grew up in the pre-digital era, uh, and so they're much more comfortable, kind of intuitively comfortable with digital devices. And I often get that question. I'll say, well, isn't this just an older person's problem? Because
Hmm.
younger folks are more comfortable with the digital stuff. So won't that make it okay? Sadly, the answer is no, because their unconscious minds aren't any better exchanging information through digital devices just because they're comfortable with them. In fact, it's somewhat the reverse, because if you're comfortable with it, then you won't necessarily work hard to try to overcome the perceived barriers of virtual uh, the virtual world. Um, but as we see with the evidence of the educational testing on kids, they couldn't learn online, and they weren't getting socialized either. So it's a huge challenge, and comfort with the technology is nice, but it doesn't help you communicate anymore, because you still got the same five senses, and that your unconscious mind is still communicating in the same way. So we all need to learn how to be um, more vulnerable, more authentic, and faster. And I think another way to think about it, if I can take one more minute here
Please.
on this, is that one of the dangers I found in doing the research for the book is that your identity can get fixed online. And
Hmm.
I use the example of Professor Robert Kelly, who was briefly famous when I was doing the research for the book. And he was a an expert in South Korean politics. He was from the United Kingdom. And the BBC had asked him to come on the show, the evening news, and talk about his expertise because something was going on in South Korea at the time. I think the president was being indicted for corruption or something. So it was a big deal. Excuse me. And they, as they want to get an expert on. And what happened, and remember, this is pre-pandemic, so there was a lot less comfort with video conferencing. But Professor Robert Kelly was ready, had his tie on, his suit on, and he even put a map of the world up behind him in his office so it would look erudite. And so he's pining away. And in that moment, what happened was a classic Zoom bomb, which we're all very familiar with now, but then was really strange. His two kids, who were very small, like 1 or 2 years old, came in, and he was completely thrown by it, of course. And he tried to sort of push the first one that was coming in away, and everybody laughed. The world laughed, became an instant meme. Everybody thought, "Oh, how funny!" And Professor Robert Kelly didn't think it was funny. He thought it was tragically embarrassing, and so much so that they had recently a follow-up, which was like 6 years later. How's Professor Robert Kelly doing? And the whole discussion was, well, I've come to terms with it. I'm at peace with it now. And I can even laugh about it a little bit. But you realize that this was a huge traumatic event in his life. And for the rest of us, it was just a funny meme on Zoom or on YouTube. But his life got fixed at that point to a certain extent. And it turns out for the rest of his life, then he's now going to be dealing with this. It's still the case. If you type in Professor Robert Kelly, what comes up is not his lifelong work in South Korean politics, but this one dumb moment on the BBC. And so the virtual world has a way of fixing our identities because machines look at it and remember forever and don't forget and keep showing the same thing over and over and over again. We humans are a little more elastic and flexible than that. So if you and I get together and we're meeting for the first time, and I spill coffee on myself, let's say, and I'm embarrassed by it, over time I'll forget about that. But if it's a meme on and you'll forget about it, and you'll go, yeah, that Nicky wasn't as clumsy as he seemed. He seems to be able to drink coffee on a regular basis at other times without spilling on himself. So good on him. And then over time, we sort of mellow out that judgment. But online, if that fictional moment, let me hasten to say, had been caught on YouTube, then that would have been my identity forever.
I think
so. It's thinking about. So I think it's really important, in addition to being vulnerable and authentic, I think it's really important for people, if we're going to be in a virtual world, to think about in a way which we don't have to do in the in-person world. What is our persona? That's the word I like to use for it. But you could think of it in terms of what's my online brand, if you want to simplify it down even more. Let's say, how am I showing up in this, and how can I show up in a way that I'm comfortable with and that represents me in some way that isn't horrific like it is for poor Professor Robert Kelly? So I think there's work to do.
Yeah, it's a difficult catch-22 also, because when what we want is to be more vulnerable and authentic, but we know that the risk is, in my vulnerability, I may do something stupid. I may say something that, later on I recognize was incorrect, or, I've even thought about that as I started this podcast. Sometimes I've had these little foibles on the podcast, and I've thought, well, it's going out into the world and the internet now, and I can't do anything about it. And there is this level of discomfort when we want to be really human online. And I think it's a difficult thing to convince people to do, because there is this lower risk when we have this projection of myself that maybe isn't completely me, because then if somebody rejects that, then I know that me is still safe back here behind this layer of anonymity. And so how do you, I think this is where this ties in with all the work that you've done with teaching people and coaching people in the public speaking sphere. So if we think about the introvert at the party who has to push through this level of internal discomfort in service of this bigger goal of connecting and communicating with somebody on a authentic level,
Mhm.
that is only amplified in a public speaking sphere. So when you're asking someone to get in front of hundreds or thousands of people, there is a job that comes along with that of how to navigate this internal landscape of discomfort and anxiety and fear. And that's really what I think this larger conversation of how to show up authentically online and how to show up with vulnerability and honesty in person as well is, how do we navigate this discomfort on the inside and this fear on the inside of being rejected, and knowing too now that people's negativity bias plays really heavily into our online communication and also our in-person communication. How do you help people navigate that?
Yes, well, that is a large part of my work, and the first thing I think of is I got a call from this was probably 3 or 4 years before the pandemic, from a famous fashion icon as the head of his own company, and he was getting a lifetime award, a fashion dude, and it was sort of like an Oscar for the fashion industry. And he had only spoken before. He'd managed to structure his life so he didn't have to speak in public. He'd spoken to small groups of his employees. He was fine with that, as many as 50. But the idea of talking to between 750 and 1,000 of his peers, all dressed in black tie and evening gowns, looking very fashionable, I'm sure, um, and having the spotlight swing to him, would you please congratulate, and everybody applauding wildly, and then the silence falls and he has to say something in 5 minutes that seems modest and charming and also significant, and has to remember to thank the right people, and there's a lot to do in that 5 to 7 minute speech he's going to give. And he was absolutely petrified. And it turned out that he'd had this, as he told it, this traumatic event when he was a youngster. He'd spoken up in class and the students had laughed at him, and that had become magnified in his mind, something that was so terrifying that I could literally hear his voice shaking on the phone as we talked about it. And this was about 6 weeks before the event. So that fear of exposure, that fear of making a mistake, that fear of doing the wrong thing goes back, apparently, as far as we know, to ancient times, when it was just as scary to stand up in front of your tribe as as might be to appear on a stage now. Has been around forever, and it seems to be a fear of exposure. And at its base, the theory seems to be that it's a fear of getting driven out from the tribe. We humans can't survive on our own, literally. So we need the tribe around us, and so it's the fear of getting rejected ultimately by your peers or your tribe or your friends and family or what have you, and that's a devastating fear. Everybody, I think, has it to a certain extent. It's just some people are really traumatized and immobilized by it, and other people aren't. So that's often where the work starts, is figuring out what's up with that and how to get through that, and then still be out the other end, authentic and vulnerable and charming, and do all the things you need to do. I often think back to, there's a TED Talk by a woman named Susan Cain called Quiet, which for any of your viewers and listeners who think about this at all, I recommend highly. She launched her career on that. Sadly, you can't do that on TED anymore because there's just too much TED. But she walked out with a suitcase full of stuff and plunked it down in the red circle of the stage, and started talking about how nervous she was because she was an introvert. And that, in her case, was very authentic and very vulnerable, and it came across as such, and people celebrated it as such, and as I say, it launched her career. And unfortunately, once you've done that once, it's not sort of the same when somebody else does it. So it isn't quite as effective if you stand up in front of your group and say, I'm really nervous. People often do, but the audience tends to be a bit impatient and said, yeah, I know we're all nervous, keep going. That's just a sort of step one, preliminary step that you should do off stage before you get on there. And so we're less willing to cut each other that kind of slack. And we just expect you to get on with it. And that's where the real work begins. And it's really difficult to find out what is it I'm going to say about myself? How am I going to present myself in a way that is interesting to the audience and I'm comfortable doing? Somewhere between all the information in the world and too little, TMI on the one hand and too little on the other, there's this swath down the middle that you can get it just right. And that's another thing we work on a lot in this day and age. What is TMI? Because people shut off very quickly when it feels like TMI. There's an imaginary line that when you cross it, then immediately everybody's, oh God, kill me now. And they start tuning out. So you can't cross that line, but where is it exactly is often hard to figure. And so there are a lot of pitfalls to navigate in finding your vulnerable and authentic self and how to share that with the world.
Something that you mentioned towards the beginning of this conversation was that people are very concerned with what your intention is in saying something. And so I would imagine that a large part of this conversation about who do you want to show up as online, how do you want to speak publicly, it's really getting really clear and dialed in on what your intention is behind what you want to share. And that's probably a good way for people to navigate that realm of TMI, because it really forces you to ask yourself before you share anything, what is my purpose in sharing this? And many times people don't think about that. They just think about like, well, I just want people to know who I am, or I need external validation for whatever the thing is that I'm going through. And I think a better way to think about that is, in what way is what I'm sharing in service to the people that are listening? And in this, age where we do feel very alone frequently, I mean, I would say that that's probably one of my big motivating factors, is that when I share something that is vulnerable, authentic, honest, then hopefully on the other end of the communication is someone saying, oh my goodness, I thought I was the only one. I thought I was the only one that felt like this. And I love this conversation around that many people, like you said, have these fears that have been baked into their childhood experience that can contribute to them not being able to show up in the way that they want to in adulthood. And so much of our conversation today has revolved around the unconscious mind and how much of that contributes to our communication. And it's a really fascinating thing to think about. Okay, then what can I do to address the conversation that's happening beneath the conversation? And some of that gets into, how do you build rapport with people, being at home in your body enough to understand how you're feeling and how you're moving and what your posture is communicating to another person. And so much of that is lost online, but it's a really valuable skill to develop. When one of the last quotes that I wrote down from your book is that it says all of these worlds are half physical and half virtual, and increasingly they all connect with each other. And so you talked about, how do we code switch from our online reality to our in-person reality? And it is really unfortunate when you see someone online and then you get the chance to meet them in person and you're like, this is not the same person. So how I guess I'm wondering, like, how do you encourage the people that you work with to have a through line from their online persona and their online world to their personal world?
Yeah, it's really important to get that exactly right, because I'm working with people who are often trying to become public figures in the sense they're going to be speaking or selling books or marketing themselves online and trying to make a business out of that. So, or they're executives who are at least sometimes in the public eye. And so we have to find this line that's authentic, because if it's inauthentic, you can't sustain it.
Mm.
And the cracks are going to show at some point. We can think of in the last few years all kinds of hilarious and tragic instances where those cracks showed up and somebody was revealed to be doing something online that they wish the world didn't know about, right? And so it's best to be authentic, but the world isn't interested in the whole authentic you. It only wants the relevant bits, and I think your point was very nicely made. It wants the parts that matter to the audience, to me as a listener in the audience. Tell me what's in it for me. And that's not selfish so much as I want to know the shared parts, the parts that I can learn from or that mean something to me. Growing up, I used to occasionally be allowed to sit at the grown-ups table when I was a kid with my grandmother's house, and she had a very nice table, and often there were guests. And she had a phrase when we kids were allowed to sit with the grown-ups. If we wandered off into some childish thing, she would rap the table and say, "Not of general interest, Nicholas." As you can imagine, my cousins and I lived in holy terror of being rapped to order with that one. And and so it early started in me a sense of what's of general interest, and what are the things that other people want to know about, and what's only a personal interest to me. And that line gets drawn differently on the line now, and it gets drawn differently in the modern era. That line keeps changing, but we all need to figure out where it is for us and what we should share about ourselves and what we're comfortable sharing about ourselves. And I think the real test is that what feels nurturing at the end of the day. That I told a story in my third book, Power Cues, about fracturing my skull and going into a coma and not being able to read body language when I woke back up and having to relearn that, right? So I tell that story. And for me, I kept that a secret a long time. I was sort of embarrassed by it because I'd been riding a toboggan and I thought that was kind of dumb. And so I was embarrassed that this had happened to me and that I'd lost this thing and had to learn back again. And the first time I talked about it happened to be to a group of IBM engineers. I gave the speech. I thought it was time to come clean on this and say why I was so interested in it. And the end of the speech came and there was this moment of silence. And I thought, oh my God, they all hate me. They hated that story. And then they started that kind of slow clap, which got more and more. And they were really going for it. And it was so moving for me to think, oh, they don't hate me. It was worth sharing. And then at the end, at the back of the hall, there was this giant guy who had come in a little bit late and didn't have a chair. So he was standing the whole time. And I kind of half noticed him. Anyway, he started running toward me. And he was, when I say giant, he was like 6'8". I'm tall, I'm 6'1", but he was 6'8". So he towered above even me. And he had a huge head of gray hairs all fly away and a beard, a giant gray beard that went almost down to his waistline. So he looked like, Nanook of the North coming at me. And I thought, oh my God, this guy hated me. He's going to kill me. What's going to happen here? And instead, he picked me up in this huge hug. There were tears running down his cheeks. And he said, thank you for sharing that story, because what you're describing is what some people with autism experience. And for the first time now, because of the way you explained it, I have an insight into how my son feels, my son with autism. And I think I can relate to him. So he was just deeply appreciative and moved. I had no idea when I told the story that I would connect with somebody like that. So it was incredibly nurturing for me as well as for him to be able to tell that story. And it felt worth it. So I think that's the test really is if you find your community and you find your story and it's embraced by the community and people give you the feedback that is valuable, then it's worth doing. Yeah.
I had thought about I thank you for sharing both of those stories. I thought about your grandmother rapping on the table and saying, not of general interest. And I thought, if your audience was different, if you're like, my son loves talking about Mario video games. And, to me, I could say not of general interest, but if he's talking to other little boys his age that are also totally interested in that, yes, this is how they're connecting. And so it is, it just is like this nice little cue to be cognizant of the audience that we're talking to is going to be interested in different things depending on where they're at in their life. But what struck me about this story and the experience that you shared about having to relearn how to recognize and interpret nonverbal cues is that
Mm,
I immediately thought of people that were on the autism spectrum disorder,
mhm,
and I thought of people who have this kind of lack of social lubricant, I guess, in being able to understand those things. But what struck me about that is that you were able to learn that, which means
mm,
that this is a skill that can be developed. So not only is this important for us to know about a generation that is growing up in this digital age where they are lacking the skills to have this in-person communication, that makes me understand, okay, this can be taught. So even the kids who had to muddle through their messy middle school years during the pandemic online,
mhm.
that they still have access to learning some of those important social things that they missed at that point, but that this is something that just because it feels uncomfortable doesn't mean that anything has gone wrong. So for the
Right.
introvert who's in a room full of people and they don't want to talk to anybody because it's uncomfortable, understanding that you can learn the skills to become a better communicator. You can learn the skills to read body language. You can develop the ability to connect with people on these deeper levels if you are committed to learning them.
Yeah, I always start with the thought that every communication is two conversations always.
Mm,
And we're mostly aware of the one. And if you're that is the content conversation. The other
mm,
conversation is the intent conversation, which is largely through the body language. And so you've got these two conversations going on. They're very different. If you're a happy extrovert, life's your oyster. You can go out and talk to people. You don't have any
mm.
trouble with that. You don't think about that second conversation. If you're an introvert, then what happens is you go back afterwards and you think, oh my God, I stared too much at that person, or I was doing something stupid with my hands, or you obsess about the ways in which things might have gone wrong. Sometimes it's about the content, but surprisingly often it's about the intent conversation or the body language and what you did that was embarrassing or you felt awkward or something. And so that being aware of both those conversations is the place to start with that. And as you say, it's something that we can all learn to get better at, to get more comfortable. And also, and I would just circle back to finding the audience that is your audience too. And so that involves knowing yourself and knowing the kinds of people you're going to connect better with than others. But that's, I think that's key. Not everybody's going to be your friend in this world. Not everybody's
Mm.
going to want to hear your story. That's okay. Last time I checked, there are like 7 billion people in the world or more. The number's going up. There are a lot of folks
Mm,
there. There's plenty. That is one of the great things about the virtual world, is that it's astonishingly easy compared to the pre-virtual world to find your audience in a way that was just much, much harder in the past. So yeah, you made that point beautifully, I thought, when you said you tend to think you're all alone or you're the only one.
mm.
And nowadays you can find your tribe online and realize that you're not alone.
Yeah.
Humans, especially in the United States, are taught that we are individualist species, and we're cowboys,
Hmm.
or whatever, and it's we're supposed to be individualistic and stand on our own, that kind of thing. But actually, the highest happiness and sort of use of people is when they're in a group and everybody's through these things called mirror neurons, everybody's experiencing and sharing the same emotion.
Mm.
And we've all experienced this. We've been to uh, a sports event where we get excited, or a rock concert where we all get moved by the same song, or even a political event or a speech that moves everybody. We love to get together in groups, and it's to share those emotions and to feel connected and not to feel alone. And so, finding your tribe is in the virtual world is even more important, I think.
Hmm. It's such a fascinating phenomenon to be in a group and to be experiencing the swell of emotions that are amplified by being able to share it with someone else. And I've often thought about, if you were watching your favorite sports team and they made this awesome play and won the game and you were out of your seat cheering and so excited. If you have somebody sitting next to you who is like 0% interested in sports, then you can still enjoy it, but it's not the same as having somebody next to you who's, head to toe in the same paint that you are with the foam
Right.
fingers and screaming their heads off. They're just as excited. And there is something really amazing about the and this only happens in humans as far as I know, that our joy is amplified when we have someone to share the experience with.
Mm,
And that, I guess, that's a great kind of bow to put on this whole conversation of
mm,
when we are only ever doing that virtually, we're missing out on some of the most fundamental things that make us human, is
mhm.
this in-person energetic exchange that happens when you're both looking at the same thing and in awe at the same thing, or celebrating the same thing, or sharing each other's hurt in those moments and the grief. And there's nothing that can compare to being with someone to experience life.
Yeah, it's so true. The conversations people often have these days is, I'll just wait till that movie, which is a big hit, comes out on stream or comes out
Mm.
online, because I can watch in the comfort of my own home, and it'll be so much more convenient. I won't have to buy tickets and go to a theater and find parking and blah blah blah, do all those things, and then you remember, if you have gone to a movie in the past 10 years or something, the experience of watching a funny movie and hearing everybody
Mm.
laugh, it's completely infectious. You see, if you watch that same movie at home alone on your sofa, you're not going to laugh
Mm.
anything like as much, if at all. And the same with scary movies too. You'll shriek with terror all at the same
Right.
time, right? So the sharing of emotions is just in those simple ways, as well, in the more complicated ones, is just part of the essence of being human. And you're absolutely right. We need that. We need that to be fully human. And it's a mistake to think of ourselves as individualistic monads who have to
Mm.
get along okay on our own. And the problem with the virtual world is it makes that all too easy. And then there'll be a point where first you don't know what you're missing, and then at some point you'll realize that something is lacking. Hopefully you'll go out and connect with people in person and find what that is, um, rather than get depressed or feel too
Mm.
isolated or alone to do something about it, because that
The
would be
word,
really tragic.
yeah, certainly. The word that you used is convenience. It'd be so much more convenient to watch this from my couch. And what I thought was that convenience can be a real barrier to true connection. And so we have to we have to check ourselves in, am I sinking into the convenience and the comfortability of how easy it is to be online, because it is more effort to be in person with someone, but the payoff is worth it, to slog through the discomfort of being in person, because we can recognize that the ROI on in-person communication, in-person connection is, it's through the roof compared to what we're going to be able to get ever virtually.
Yeah, and we mentioned the business world some time back, but in terms of careers and in terms of your influence in the business setting, it it's very hard to exert influence and persuasion widely online, right?
Mm.
It's just much more difficult to do, and so you'll find, I found during the pandemic, I'd be coaching some executives from a company, and then I'd often get called in to do some training for the lower level employees. So I did a lot of on the spot quizzes and testing, just to see how everybody was doing. And it was fascinating because the executives, to a man and woman, couldn't wait to get back in person. And the employees who were actually doing the work, who were being measured on their productivity, they were pretty happy being at home, especially once they got over the initial challenges of juggling the children in the daycare and whatever else they had to juggle. Maybe the cat appearing on Zoom. Once you got used to those things, then then you really appreciated not having to do the commute and having more productivity, and yet being able to take a break in the middle of the day and go walk your dog and come back. So it was a real improvement for them. And it was fascinating to see these two completely different attitudes. But it's because, when you think about it, the primary job of the executive is to manage people, not to do the actual work. That would be micromanaging. It's very hard to manage people and to influence them and to persuade them of the importance of things through the virtual connection. It's much easier and much more satisfying to do that in person. The folks who are doing the actual work, doing the coding or whatever it is, much easier to do that if you're not surrounded in a set of cubes with noise and distraction and things going on. It's much easier to do that at home when you can control the environment to a much greater extent. And I knew watching this that whenever the pandemic would end, that we were coming to a collision point where some tough decisions were going to have to be made. My favorite example of this was a company that I've been working with. They studied the policy. This was halfway through 2022. They studied the policy for 6 months to figure out what's the best return to work policy. And meanwhile, they fixed up the home office and put in all kinds of perks and nice things. There were cappuccino machines everywhere now. The place looks fabulous. I've been there a few times since, and but they really did a nice job making it alluring to come back. And they studied it. Everybody's involved, HR and all the other departments, and they said you have to be in the workplace in person 3 days out of every month. And nobody complained about that. The policy went through. Everybody said, great, yeah, we can live with that. No issues. And then when the time came to implement it, whenever they were pressing the back to work button, which I think was last fall, everybody started, well, not coming back, basically. Everybody started coming in 3 days a month. And within 6 weeks, the CEO had arbitrarily changed the policy to, you have to be in the office 3 days a week. And there was this huge outcry, like, well, that isn't what you told us. And we studied it and we came up with this other decision. But that was the collision between the need of the executives to manage teams of people and the ability to see them face to face. And it couldn't be done any other way. It's a case where both parties were right, and there was just tension between the two things. And in this case, the management got to call the shots.
Yeah.
Usually what happens.
Yes. I think to your point, like that there isn't any one right way to do this. There isn't any one right way to integrate the virtual and the in person, but the understanding of the strengths and the weaknesses of both, the risks of both of them, and weighing the risks and the benefits, and coming up with a policy that makes the most sense for that particular team.
Yeah. I mean, that's all you can do is muddle through in exactly that way and figure out what the best compromise is, because it is a compromise between the needs of people who have, as I say, coding or something specific to do, and the people who have the larger aims of the company to work for.
Yeah.
They're not fully aligned in what's best in many specific instances.
So what is the book that you're working on right now? What is this book about?
Well, I've been fascinated by the voice for a long time, the human voice. There are a couple of touch points. I did write about a specific aspect of really fascinating neuroscientific research on the human voice in power cues. So it's one of the chapters in the book. And so much has happened since then in neuroscience that it was obviously time to go back. But it really started from the idea that certain voices affect you in ways that other voices just don't. And like, I had the good fortune once to hear Oprah give a speech, in public, and her voice is just extraordinary. And even over this amplification system, which can distort and not bring the full human voice out always, even over that, it was clear that this was just a powerful voice, and it moved us and grabbed us in ways that were extraordinary. And then a personal favorite, hearing Adele sing. She's just got this big voice, which it feels like she's putting 125% of her personality into it.
Hmm.
And more prosaically, I run into that all the time. I hear people who are strangling their voices and holding back, and people who are bringing their full voices to whatever the situation is. And there are all kinds of reasons people usually have for holding back. But I'm writing a book to help people bring out 100% of their voices. I was working recently with an executive, and she's one of the inspirations for writing the book now. And she had a tiny voice, and she was incredibly smart and was due to be promoted. But the feedback was, you have to be able to lead meetings, and frankly, in this industry, it's mostly men. You're one of the few female voices. You're getting drowned out by these more aggressive male voices, and your voice is small. Right? You just have to make it larger. And she had always believed that physically her voice was limited. There was something wrong with her, so she could only speak in this tiny little voice. And in working with her, it was clear, without going into the details, there were some psychological barriers. And once we worked through those, her voice came out much stronger than it was. And that was just so moving to see her stepping up into the role that she so richly deserved, and being able to command the space. So it's helping people figure that out for themselves. What is your voice? Sort of a capital V. What's your cosmic voice? What is it? In a way, it's saying, what do you have to add to the world? And there are often lots of little v technical reasons, issues with the voice. And I'm going to write about some of those, and then write about how you think about bringing your full voice out. Because by the time you get to the end of your life, if you haven't brought your full voice out, humanity has suffered in some way. We've lost something. We need all our voices.
I'm really excited to read that book. I'm already anticipating greatly enjoying that, because there is something really powerful to understanding that, humans are very driven by story. But if you don't have a way to effectively communicate that story, to your point, that humanity misses out. And I love that idea of the capital V voice, finding out what really lights you up and being able to communicate that to other people, because there's not just for the benefit of other people, but there's something that really is intrinsically valuable to being able to communicate this in the internal landscape to other people. That's important. There's something even just in the speaking of your inner thoughts and your story and your experiences. There is something very healing and whole and important about doing that. Even if nobody hears it on the other end, there is something really important about developing our own voice. So I know we're bumping up against the end of our time here, but thank you so much for spending so much time with me this morning and for discussing this incredibly important topic of how to navigate in this virtual world, and how to not only become a better communicator, but also to be able to connect with people in the way that we find most deeply satisfying.
It's such a pleasure to chat with you and to see you again, Morgan. So thank you for having me on your show.
My pleasure. And to everybody, before we go, P.S. we expect